Dmitri Volkov was a 280-pound power machine raised in the Russian wrestling tradition. Chuck Norris was a 73-year-old master representing technical perfection earned through 50 years of experience. That day, it would become clear which was truly superior. The Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs stood as America's premier facility for developing world-class athletes, where the nation's most promising competitors came to push the boundaries of human performance. Within its state-of-the-art wrestling rooms, champions were forged through a combination of cutting-edge sports science and time-tested training methods that had produced Olympic gold medalists for decades. Dmitri "Bear" Volkov dominated this elite environment like a force of nature. At 30 years old, standing 6 feet 4 inches and weighing 280 pounds of solid muscle, he represented the pinnacle of power-based wrestling. His massive frame was the product of Siberian genetics and a lifetime spent in Russia's legendary wrestling programs, where strength was considered the ultimate virtue and technical finesse was often viewed as compensation for physical inadequacy. Dmitri's blonde hair and thick beard gave him the appearance of a Viking warrior, while his shoulders stretched the limits of any training gear designed for normal-sized humans. Every movement he made generated attention, not just because of his size, but because of the aura of physical dominance that surrounded him like an invisible field of intimidation. In Russia, we have saying, Dmitri would tell anyone within earshot, his accent thick with the harsh consonants of his homeland. Strong bear does not need to dance. Strong bear simply crushes everything in path. This philosophy had served Dmitri extraordinarily well throughout his career. He had been the European champion 3 times, held multiple world championship medals, and was widely considered the strongest wrestler pound for pound in the sport's history. His signature technique, a devastating double-leg takedown followed by crushing top pressure, had ended careers and shattered the confidence of countless opponents who thought they could match his power. But Dmitri's success had come with a price. Years of dominating through pure strength had made him dismissive of fighters who relied on technique, timing, or strategy. In his worldview, these were the tools of the weak, clever compensations used by men who lacked the genetic gifts necessary for true athletic dominance. The training facility's head coach, Tom Richards, was a former Olympic wrestler himself who had worked with elite athletes for over 20 years. He understood Dmitri's value as a competitor, but he also recognized the dangerous arrogance that was beginning to define the Russians' approach to his sport. "Dmitri, you need to work on your technique," Tom would say during their regular training sessions. "Strength alone won't be enough against the best wrestlers in the world." Dmitri would typically respond with a demonstration of his power, lifting training partners who outweighed most professional athletes and tossing them around the mat like children. "Coach Tom, I respect your experience, but look at results. Strength wins matches. Everything else is just theory for weak men." That Tuesday afternoon, the training center was hosting a special visit from Chuck Norris, who had been invited to speak with the athletes about mental discipline and the philosophical foundations of martial arts. The visit was part of an ongoing program designed to help elite athletes develop the psychological tools necessary to perform under pressure at the highest levels of international competition. Chuck arrived at the facility dressed in simple workout clothes, his presence immediately recognizable but characteristically understated. At 73 years old, he moved through the training center with the controlled grace of someone who had spent decades understanding the mechanics of human movement and the psychology of combat. Accompanying Chuck were Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a sports psychologist who specialized in elite athlete development, and Marcus Chen, a documentary filmmaker who was creating a series about the intersection of traditional martial arts and modern athletic training. "Mr. Norris," Dr. Mitchell explained as they toured the facility, "these athletes represent the pinnacle of physical development in their respective sports, but many of them struggle with the mental aspects of competition at the highest levels." Chuck nodded thoughtfully, watching the various training sessions taking place around them. Physical ability can take you far, but it's the mental and spiritual components that separate good athletes from truly great ones. As they moved through the wrestling area, Chuck's attention was naturally drawn to Dmitri, who was in the middle of a training session that looked more like a demonstration of controlled violence than athletic preparation. The Russian was working with a rotation of training partners, each one lasting only minutes before being completely overwhelmed by his size and strength. Dmitri noticed the small group observing his session and immediately recognized an opportunity to showcase his abilities to a broader audience. His ego, always hungry for validation, responded to the presence of cameras and what appeared to be some kind of documentary crew. "You are here to film real wrestling?" Dmitri called out, his voice carrying across the training room as he paused between partners. Marcus stepped forward with his camera. We're documenting different approaches to martial arts and athletic training. This is Chuck Norris. I'm sure you know his work. Dmitri's eyes settled on Chuck with the kind of dismissive assessment he typically reserved for opponents he considered physically irrelevant. Here was a 73-year-old man in basic workout clothes, clearly not possessing the kind of imposing physical presence that Dmitri associated with serious fighters. Chuck Norris, Dmitri said, extending his massive hand in what appeared to be a respectful greeting, but was actually a subtle test of grip strength. Yes, I know your movies. Walker, Texas Ranger, very entertaining. Chuck shook Dmitri's hand with firm confidence, neither trying to match the Russian's crushing grip nor being intimidated by it. Thank you. I understand you're quite accomplished in competitive wrestling. 3-time European champion, multiple world medals, Dmitri replied with obvious pride. I represent what modern wrestling looks like when you combine superior genetics with scientific training methods. Chuck nodded appreciatively. Competitive wrestling requires tremendous dedication and skill. The level of athletes here is genuinely impressive. Dr. Mitchell sensed an interesting dynamic developing and moved closer to capture the interaction for her research. The contrast between Chuck's humble demeanor and Dmitri's obvious self-importance could provide valuable insights into different approaches to confidence and competition. You know, Dmitri continued, warming to his favorite topic, I have always been curious about traditional martial arts. In movies, they look very impressive, but in real competition, he shrugged with exaggerated diplomacy. Modern athletes are simply too strong, too fast, too well-trained for old-style fighting methods to be effective. Chuck listened thoughtfully, showing no sign of offense at the implicit criticism. Traditional and modern approaches each have their strengths. What would you say defines effective wrestling in your view? Dmitri's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of question that allowed him to demonstrate his philosophical superiority over outdated training methods. Effective wrestling is very simple. You must be stronger than your opponent. Everything else, technique, strategy, mental games, these are just tools for weak men who cannot develop real power. Strength is certainly important, Chuck agreed. What about other factors? Leverage, timing, understanding your opponent's intentions. Dmitri laughed, the sound echoing through the training room. Mr. Norris, with respect, when you have true power, these things become, how do you say, unnecessary complications. Watch. Dmitri gestured toward one of his training partners, a 220-pound former college champion who had been struggling unsuccessfully to match the Russian strength for the past 10 minutes. This man has excellent technique, very good understanding of wrestling strategy. But watch what happens when real power is applied. What followed was less a wrestling match than a demonstration of physical dominance. Dmitri simply overpowered his training partner through superior size and strength, neutralizing every technical attempt through brute force application. The match ended with the smaller wrestler pinned helplessly beneath Dmitri's crushing weight. You see, Dmitri said, barely breathing hard despite the intense exertion. Technique is interesting for scholars to discuss, but power wins matches. Chuck had watched the demonstration with obvious respect for Dmitri's physical abilities, but his expression suggested he was seeing something beyond what the Russian intended to showcase. Your strength is remarkable, Chuck said genuinely. What would you think about exploring different approaches to the same principles? Perhaps we could look at how traditional methods might complement modern training. Dmitri's competitive instincts immediately activated. This was perfect, an opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of modern power-based wrestling to a documentary crew, using a famous but physically outdated martial artist as a teaching example. I would be very interested, Dmitri said, his tone suggesting he expected to be providing the education rather than receiving it. It could be good for your documentary to show how wrestling has evolved beyond traditional limitations. Chuck nodded. What would you suggest as a meaningful comparison? Dmitri didn't hesitate. Basic wrestling fundamentals, takedowns, control positions, escape techniques, the foundation of all grappling arts. Excellent choice, Chuck agreed. Those are indeed the fundamentals that everything else builds from. Tom Richards approached the group, recognizing that something significant was developing. Dmitri, remember that Mr. Norris is a guest here. Keep it respectful. Of course, Coach Tom, Dmitri replied. though his tone suggested he was more focused on the learning opportunity he was about to provide. Mr. Norris understands this is educational demonstration. Yes? I will be very careful not to hurt elderly gentlemen. The condescending nature of Dmitri's comment was unmistakable, but Chuck simply smiled and began some light stretching to prepare for whatever was about to unfold. His movements were fluid and controlled, showing the kind of mobility that most people half his age couldn't achieve. As word spread through the training center that something unusual was happening, other athletes and coaches gathered around the mat area. The prospect of seeing Chuck Norris engage in some kind of grappling demonstration with one of the world's strongest wrestlers was too intriguing to miss. Dmitri prepared for the encounter with the kind of casual confidence that came from years of physical dominance. He went through his usual warm-up routine, dynamic movements designed to activate the explosive power systems that had made him nearly unbeatable in international competition. Chuck's preparation was markedly different. He stood quietly, centering himself through what appeared to be meditation rather than physical activation. To most observers, the contrast was striking. Dmitri looked like a machine powering up for battle, while Chuck appeared to be achieving some kind of internal calm. "Whenever you are ready," Dmitri announced, bouncing slightly on his toes as his body prepared for the kind of explosive movement that typically ended wrestling matches before they truly began. Chuck positioned himself across from the Russian, adopting a stance that looked classical but relaxed. "I'm ready when you are." Dmitri exploded forward with the kind of devastating double-leg takedown that had demolished Olympic-level competitors. His attack was technically sound, explosively powerful, and delivered with the full commitment of someone who had never failed to overwhelm an opponent through pure strength. But Chuck wasn't there. The evasion wasn't dramatic or athletic. Chuck simply adjusted his position with minimal movement, allowing Dmitri's charge to pass harmlessly by. As the Russian stumbled past, Chuck gently guided his momentum with a subtle hand placement that sent Dmitri rolling across the mat in a controlled but undeniable takedown. The training room fell completely silent. No one could quite process what they had just witnessed. A 280-pound world champion wrestler had been taken down by a 73-year-old man who appeared to have barely moved. Dmitri rolled to his feet, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion. "What happened? How did you?" "Leverage and timing," Chuck explained patiently. "You committed fully to an attack based on overwhelming power. When that power was redirected rather than resisted, it worked against you instead of for you." Dmitri shook his head, his worldview beginning to experience uncomfortable stress. "No, that was luck. Random occurrence. Let me try again." Chuck nodded. "Of course." This time, Dmitri approached more cautiously, using his superior reach and strength to establish grips that should have given him complete control over the encounter. His hands locked onto Chuck with the kind of crushing force that typically ended resistance before it could begin. Chuck allowed the grips to be established, then demonstrated something that Dmitri had never encountered in his years of international competition. Rather than fighting against the Russian strength, Chuck used subtle adjustments in position and leverage to make Dmitri's power irrelevant. Within seconds, Dmitri found himself face down on the mat, completely immobilized by a control position that didn't rely on strength but rather on perfect understanding of human biomechanics. Chuck was applying no painful pressure, using no dangerous techniques. He had simply positioned himself in such a way that Dmitri's considerable strength became useless. "I don't understand," Dmitri gasped, his voice muffled by the mat. "You are not strong enough to do this. This is not possible." Chuck released the position and helped Dmitri to his feet. "Strength is just one tool among many. When you understand leverage, timing, and positioning well enough, you can accomplish more with less effort than most people can accomplish with maximum exertion." Dmitri sat on the edge of the mat, staring at his hands as if they had betrayed him. Everything he had believed about wrestling, about competition, about what made fighters effective, was being challenged by someone who had just demonstrated superior grappling ability without appearing to try. "But I am world champion," Dmitri said, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. "I have defeated best wrestlers in world using strength and power. And those victories are real," Chuck acknowledged. "Your strength is genuinely impressive, and your dedication to your sport is obvious. But strength without understanding is like trying to use a hammer for surgery. It might work sometimes, but it's not the most effective tool for the job." Tom Richards approached the mat, his expression revealing a mixture of amazement and vindication. For years, He had been trying to convince Dmitri that technique mattered as much as power. Watching Chuck demonstrate this principle so clearly was profoundly satisfying. "Dmitri," Tom said carefully, "this is what I've been trying to tell you about the importance of technical development." Dmitri looked up at his coach with new eyes. "Coach Tom, I think I have been, how do you say, missing important lessons." Chuck sat down beside the Russian wrestler, his demeanor shifting from teacher to mentor. "The principles I just used aren't secret or mysterious. They're the same fundamentals that wrestling has always taught: leverage, timing, position, and understanding your opponent's intentions. The difference is that I've had 50 years to study how those principles work." 50 years, Dmitri repeated quietly. "I have trained for 20 years and thought I understood everything." 20 years of dedicated training is impressive, Chuck said with genuine respect. "But learning never stops. The moment you think you've mastered something is usually the moment you stop growing." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, recognizing a teachable moment that went far beyond wrestling technique. "What we just witnessed demonstrates something crucial about expertise and mastery. Physical ability can take you very far, but true mastery requires integrating multiple dimensions of knowledge." Marcus continued filming, understanding that he was documenting something rare, a genuine moment of learning and growth in an elite athlete who had previously seemed immune to instruction. "Mr. Norris," Dmitri said slowly, "would you be willing to teach me? I mean, not to replace my training, but to help me understand what I am missing." Chuck studied the young wrestler thoughtfully. "Learning requires humility from both teacher and student. Are you prepared to question everything you think you know about wrestling?" Dmitri looked around the training center, at the facility where he had dominated for years, at the coaches who had tried to expand his understanding, at the other athletes who had watched him learn a lesson that would reshape his entire approach to competition. "Yes," Dmitri said simply, "I am ready to be student again." Over the following months, Dmitri's wrestling underwent a complete transformation. Under Chuck's guidance, he learned to integrate technical sophistication with his natural strength, creating a more complete and efficient fighting style. He began studying leverage, timing, and positional awareness with the same intensity he had once devoted purely to strength development. His competition results improved dramatically. Instead of overwhelming opponents through brute force, he began outmaneuvering them through superior understanding of wrestling principles. His matches became technical exhibitions rather than demonstrations of raw power. The documentary featuring their encounter became required viewing at wrestling programs throughout the country, not because of its entertainment value, but because it illustrated something fundamental about the difference between athletic ability and martial mastery. 6 months later, when Dmitri won his first world championship since meeting Chuck, he dedicated the victory to his unexpected teacher. "I learned that strength without wisdom is like car without steering wheel," he told reporters. "You might go fast, but you cannot control where you go." Chuck watched the competition from his home in Texas, proud not of the victory but of the growth it represented. The young wrestler who had dismissed traditional martial arts as obsolete had become a bridge between old wisdom and new application. Real strength, Chuck reflected to a friend, isn't about overpowering others. It's about understanding principles so deeply that power becomes effortless. Years later, when Dmitri had become one of the most respected wrestling coaches in the world, he would tell his students about the day he learned that technique is superior to strength. "I thought being strongest meant being best," he would say. "Chuck Norris taught me that being smartest means being strongest." And sometimes the most profound education comes not from books or lectures, but from the moment when everything you thought you knew gets gently but completely redefined by someone who understands the deeper principles that make mastery possible.